So this is a fairly relevant pull it to one of their towels, almost like a primer saying focus. Focus on the next one point at a time. Bend, move faster, be quicker.
An athlete makes an early mistake and then from that point onwards their performance kind of spiral down.
Typically when a cascading performance sort of goes all downhill, our thoughts become very external. What if this happens again? What are people thinking about me? Being in connection with our breath, as cliche as it sounds, is one of the most easiest techniques to get our attention back.
And often enough, that athlete is, at that moment, they turn and they look at you. They look at the face of the parent, of the coach. What is it that you should be doing? What is it that you should be saying? What should be your response?
If you're going to overemphasize on just winning, forget winning. Your child is not even going to enjoy the sport, right? The primary purpose of playing sport is so that they can have fun on it. When they're enjoying, when they're in the element, they're mindful, their performance is going to be positive.
Some athletes freeze under pressure while others thrive. More importantly, how can athletes train their minds to stay calm and perform at their best? Welcome to Raising an Athlete, and today we are tackling a challenge that almost every athlete faces at some point: game day anxiety. To discuss this important topic with us, we have Dr. Sanika Divekar. She is a sports performance and exercise psychologist and a former national level table tennis player. Dr. Sanika leads the sports psychology vertical at Empower and has worked with athletes across multiple sports from grassroots to international levels. With a deep understanding of how the mind impacts performance, she specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, and athlete-centered approaches to help athletes build mental resilience. If you're a parent or a coach who's looking to support your athlete's mental game, especially on their big day, this episode is for you. Let's get started. Welcome to Raising an Athlete.
Hi Amita, thank you so much.
So, episode 2 of our podcast, we had Dr. Nanki Chadda who had joined us, and we spoke about sports psychology in general, what the field entails, how the mental aspect impacts the game of an athlete. And I've been really excited to speak with you because in this one, we plan to speak on a very specific aspect of athlete performance, which is where all their hard work is coming together, the game day. And our topic today is going to be on mastering game day anxiety. But before that, it would be helpful to know a little more about your work as a sports psychologist and also, the profile of athletes that you work with.
Yeah. So firstly, before even becoming a sports psychologist, I was an athlete myself. So this is a fairly relevant topic to me even before I started my journey as a psychologist. So I played table tennis for about 12 years in India at the national level. and have been on the other end of how anxiety has negatively affected my performance on the table as well. And there have been certain games that are just on the top of my head, which I can remember saying this I just purely lost because of the nerves that I felt, or I wasn't able to translate my game on table. So I've had that kind of experience. And now, as a sports psychologist as well, one of the most common presentations that I see when I work with athletes. So I typically work with high performance athletes. I have naturally gravitated towards working with young athletes as well. So right from the category of under 10s, under 12s is typically when they also want to take sport up at a professional level, and right up to till they make it to the national team is the kind of spread that I work with. And I enjoy working with both team as well as individual sport. Of course, having been in Indian, I of course did gravitate more towards cricket when I was in the UK. But I have a fair spread of individual as well as team sport athletes that I
Lovely,
currently
fantastic.
work
What
with.
are the most common challenges that athletes come to you? The most common mental challenges that athletes come to you with?
Right. I think in the past six and a half years that I've been working, given the very nascent stage of where sports psychology is in India, the most common concern, or the first concern that comes to me is we want to improve our performance. Right? Either when the coach is making them a referral, if the parent is referring their own child, or the athlete is themselves referring, it is purely for a performance enhancement perspective, right? As we sort of unravel that, as we unwrap that in the session, a few that come up, firstly is performance anxiety. It's typically where there's a lot of fear of not meeting the expectation, the what if I don't make it to the squad, and those kind of thoughts and those kind of patterns coming up. There is also lowered self confidence, not believing in their own capacity, in their own skills and abilities to be able to deliver that high performance that they've been so training for. There is also burnout, where if an athlete has been in high performance training for a really long time, it does tend to lead to some kind of physical and emotional exhaustion as well. And then not knowing what can I do to have that downtime and what can I do better to integrate rest and recovery in my training is also something that comes up typically with the elite athlete population. When we play sport, injury is a part and parcel of it. So of course, issues, the mental challenges related to injuries is also something that comes up. And now we have more awareness than ever that even though it is a physical injury, it does tend to have an impact on one's mood, one's level of motivation, self-esteem, self-identity, and things like that. And that is typically when other sport science professionals like physiotherapists and nutritionists and strength and conditioning coaches tend to refer athletes to us as sports psychologists. And there's also sometimes issues about focus and concentration and not being able to sustain that level of concentration throughout the tournament or throughout one day of back-to-back competitions. And lastly, with the kind of student athlete identity, the challenges of balancing their sport and academics or sport and work responsibilities is also something that I've sort of seen as a trend in my in
So
my
you
in my
spoke about
practice.
a range of mental challenges that the athletes approach you with. Do you see a trend or a difference in young athletes versus elite athletes in the range of challenges that you spoke about?
I think more or less this is the spectrum that typically I see in my clinic, or in the kind of sessions that I've been doing so far. The valency of the issues or the pertinence and the persistence of these issues is where probably I see a lot of variance. In an elite athlete, it's probably everything coming together. The expectation to perform is a lot more from themselves, whereas in younger athletes, I've sort of seen parents being a massive source of pressure, that the athlete perceives them to be the source of pressure. Injury is also fairly something when an athlete has played sport for a considerably longer period of time is probably when they come to me for. And but I think that's the only difference. I think the extent of it, the nature of the symptoms, the manifestation of symptoms is something that is variable, but more or less this is the kind of crux of the kind of problems that athletes
Okay.
sort of
So
come to
coming
sessions for.
specifically on our topic for the day, what is game day anxiety?
I want to say outrightly that it is our body's most natural response ever. Because when you think of sport, when you think of high performance, it is a fairly chaotic and a fairly volatile environment. Athletes very rarely sort of feel that sense of control almost when they are in that kind of competitive setup. There can be, one can understand it in terms of two ways. One is which is a physiological response. So athletes may experience responses like an increased heart rate, sweaty palms. A lot of athletes tell me, oh, we feel it in my or I feel it in my stomach, or there's I feel jittery, I feel weak in my knees, or my body tightens up, or my grip becomes loose. And those are the certain signs that I can then spot, saying, hey, I think this is an anxious response that you're having to the situation. And then there also can be a few psychological responses, which typically translates into having a lot of negative thoughts or experiencing a surge of emotions from the range of anxiety, fear, panic. And that can sort of encapsulate what game day anxiety is. However, I also want to say that it's fairly normal. Performance anxiety is one of the most common, well researched topics in sport psychology and the literature as well, because sport is such a high stake environment, so to speak, for athletes.
One of the things I want to ask is that there are some athletes who thrive under pressure and there are others who struggle. So, is this a mental skill that is kind of inborn, innate, or is it something that you can be trained in?
Yeah. So I think it's a combination of factors. Of course, there are athletes who thrive under pressure, and that can be because of the combination of their psychological, say, beliefs, the kind of mental skills that they may have learned, or the kind of competitive exposure that they may have had. And of course, there are athletes who sort of succumb to the same performance pressure. So when it comes to mindset and beliefs, if an athlete is trained to perceive the competitive situation as a challenge, they are going to have a far more facilitative physiological and a cognitive response to that situation. And to ease it down, what I mean is their brain doesn't perceive it as a threat. To give you a little bit about in terms of how our brain perceives any triggering situation, is the alarm system goes off saying you are in danger now, look for safety, because safety, security is the most common human need, which is our primal response, right? So that is where I believe mental training, conditioning of the mind sort of steps in, where like you correctly said in the second part of your question, it's a skill that can be taught, right? And I tend to use a lot of cognitive behavior therapy, which is also one of the most researched therapeutic modalities for performance anxiety specifically, and for managing this performance pressure. Because let's face it, pressure never escapes any athlete. Whether you're a young athlete, whether you've been playing the sport for 10, 12 years, you're still going to feel that performance pressure. You're going to still feel that anxiety before you step onto the court, or you sort of take the ball in your hand and you're getting ready for your run up, for your over. I think it is fairly important for athletes to train themselves to learn coping skills and mechanisms which can help them manage this performance better. And I think that if you look at any elite athlete and their interviews that they sort of give after either they have won or lost, you'll always see that they always look at pressure as a privilege, right? They sort of say that it's a privilege to be playing on, say, on a center court, or to be playing for my team and having that responsibility on my shoulder. And I believe that that perspective shift happens when one is training their mind very consciously, and one is focused, that one accepts and is focused that this is going to be there. As long as I'm able to train my mind, as long as I'm able to get these butterflies to fly in formation, my performance is going to be the same, or is going to be not
Right.
negatively
So I
impacted
think
because
two
of the
things that
pressure.
you said. So one is uh, I think pre-competition nerves is natural, like you said, and a certain amount of that is required for your brain to focus and bring its complete attention to the task
Absolutely.
at hand. But the problem begins when it kind of debilitate, like leads to a debilitated response where there is anxiety, which is actually having an adverse impact on your performance. When does it become a problem, and signs for an athlete to know that that they're getting triggered?
Right. I think that's a yeah, I think that's a very important question, because as much as I want to normalize performance anxiety, and as much as I want to reassure athletes that it's a it's your body's response to the competitive situation. It is very important for athletes and the people in the athlete's vicinity to recognize these signs and symptoms of when anxiety can be absolutely debilitating, and it can be absolutely debilitating. And to answer your question very shortly, once you start noticing certain signs, and I'll come to that as well, disrupting an athlete's not just performance, but it pervades their life beyond sport as well, right? I think that is when it does become a problem, which in some cases might also need clinical intervention if it escalates to an extent where it goes towards a clinical illness or a clinical disorder. There might also be need for medication and certain different therapeutic interventions, which probably goes beyond the scope of a sports psychologist. And say some of the signs could be certain chronic symptoms, right, where the anxiety persists for far longer and is not then just limited to that one tournament that is coming up, or one, say, that one important selection trial that is coming up. So those are some signs. If you see an athlete have a very strong physiological reaction where you see signs of nausea or their sleep patterns being disturbed, you see a lot of fluctuation in their moods in the build up to the upcoming, say, tournament or selection trial, those are some things to watch out. I firmly believe there's a relationship between food and mood as well. So if you see disrupted eating patterns, you see a child not wanting to eat the way that they were eating before, or you see some kind of change, I think that's also a change, a sort of behavioral symptom to look out for. If you see persistent low mood, that is also something where you might see that the child is just paralyzed by the fear, not being motivated to go and train whatsoever, despite training being okay. So that drop in motivation is also something. Sometimes when athletes are like, no, no, but I don't want to go today, or no, I don't want to eat this, I feel nauseous, I feel sick. I think those are some signs and symptoms that the people in the vicinity need to be aware of. And these could be parents, these could be coaches, definitely. And then, of course, the first sign that a lot of people definitely take notice of, and a lot of coaches have definitely come back to me and said is ki the performance just drastically drops, right? That the athlete is not able to even keep up with the training drills. And I think that is, then that becomes the hook. And then of course investigation and sort of helping the athlete understand, saying, can you describe this more better? What happens? What's the difference? That could be a good
Yeah.
starting
Also, I suppose making
starting
them feel
conversation.
safe because, like you said, there is so much danger that they're experiencing that even every conversation is so loaded because it's leading them to the same place of danger to say that, this is what you need to do. You
Yeah.
need to face, this.
I think to build on that, actually, it's not just that I need to face. There's a persistent need that I need to win, or I need to have a conversion. I'm putting in so much effort in practice means I should win. So there's this inherent pressure and an inherent tendency for perfectionism, right? Like, I often joke with a lot of my athletes, whether they have won a match, they'll always come back to me in the sessions and say, yeah, I won, but this didn't work out. Yeah, that was an easy game, but that's because the opponent was not at my level. And I try and tell them, and I try and joke around that this but is my biggest obstacle, right? It's because they're constantly chasing that perfectionistic ideal in their own head, because they've set these goals so high. And I think that is what also makes them elite athletes and separates them as a population from the rest of us ordinary non athlete population. But I think that is also where that sense of pressure, sense of expectation, firstly from yourself, and then that just being reinforced by your environment also. Like, parents pitch in, the coaches pitch in, their peers pitch in. There's also an element of social comparison which adds to this cocktail, which only further worsens this anxiety.
I think also what I want to say that as a sport parent, this I have experienced and seen myself that so when you were speaking about that with mental training, this can be improved. There's a lot of conditioning and context that each athlete is coming from also. It could be the conditioning of their parents, the expectations, and young athletes are like sponges, right? Like they're really absorbing, they're like a blank slate. They don't, I mean, at this point of time, they may not have created certain emotional states of themselves. They're just kind of reflecting the emotional states of their parent, of their coach. The message that is being given to them is very deeply being internalized, right? And if the parent or the coach is coming from an anxious space or a space of frustration or agitation, then that's becoming like the internal voice of the athlete themselves. So how does that shift happen when, much of the conditioning actually probably would be coming from outside of the athlete? And I'm asking in context of young athletes.
Yeah, yeah. I think I completely agree with you when you say that, say, when an athlete is very, very young, they may not have the emotional skills to even be aware of what they're feeling, right? And I've seen a lot of athletes in the 10, 11-year-old kind of a age group come into the session and say, I feel very anxious, and I feel very stressed. And when I lose, I feel depressed. And I try and dispute it there and then, saying, "Can you tell me what the word means? Can you tell me what you mean when you say I feel depressed?" And more often than not, it's a word that they may have heard somewhere in the academy, some seniors talking, and they've just picked it up from there. They may not realize the gravitas the word actually means, and fair to them as well, given the age and the emotional sensibilities that they have. They still are to develop, right? So I think intervention starts right there, building that emotional awareness, age appropriate emotional awareness, and age appropriate coping mechanism is where intervention kicks in terms of the athletes. And at the same time, when it comes to parents, because I work with a lot of young athletes, I tend to also very co-work very closely with the parents, because the child tends to spend the most time with the parent. When the child as young as this decides to take up sport professionally, even for the next 5 6 years, a parent's involvement is very high, right? And it's in all areas. The parents are the ones organizing their training, looking at their travel, competition. At times I've also seen parents travel with the child for tournaments, right? So it's a massive responsibility that a parent undertakes by keeping their, say, work life and personal life and social life on hold. So naturally there is going to be a build up of expectations. There's going to be a desire for positive results all the time. And I think that is where also psycho educating the parent at every step of the way, letting them in on what is it that we are working with in the sessions with the child, keeping in the privacy and confidentiality of the athlete in mind, of course, helps them understand the extent of mental training that happens for the athlete. Also, positive reinforcement for them. Holding a space for a parent, in my experience, has been fairly valuable to me, where letting them also express the kind of built up of emotions that they feel. Or I have so many examples where parents come and ask, say, what should I say to my child when they have just lost the match? What can I do for my own child, and how can I make it better? what can I how can I start the conversation? And at times earlier in my career, I found myself quite dumbfounded, saying, I still haven't I don't have that expertise just yet. But having studied how parental involvement actually helps athletes and how it can be a facilitator for their high performance journey, there are a few techniques that I sort of advise parents. And it's never about, don't say this to your child, or don't say you should have done this better, you should have gone for training more seriously. Slowly and steadily developing that process mindset in a parent is very, very, very important, because naturally when you've invested so much time and effort and lots of resources in your child's career, it's fair on a parent's part to also expect performance from the child, periodically telling them that this is going to be a long journey. If you are in it for the long haul, you also have to be mentally resilient for your child and their performance. Building that process mindset, emphasizing on the importance and significance of effort as opposed to just single-mindedly looking at result, is something that I emphasize quite a lot. Also, one thing that I have seen work very well with parents and young kids specifically, because that's your question, is I call it the shoulder to shoulder technique, where say the child has lost a match, right, and now they're the parent and the child are on the way back home, and it's a very tense environment. The child is feeling this gamut of emotions, the parent is feeling a whole another gamut of emotions, and the conversation, if not done mindfully, can go either ways, like it can swing either ways, right? So I typically tend to tell, or I work with parents saying, why don't you start a conversation with the child when you are sitting, say, in a car or you're traveling, where you're not really, there's not enough eye contact. So the child also doesn't feel very intimidated. The child is looking at, say, the road ahead, and you are looking at the road ahead, and you bring up the conversation saying, how was the performance today? What happened on court? What do you think went wrong against, or what do you think went against you? Why do you think this didn't work out? And I believe asking these open-ended questions, as opposed to straight away coming at the child with a lot of negative feedback, can in fact develop a very strong parent-child relationship as well. Right? Validating their effort, validating their also the kind of investment that the child has made, and not almost dismissing, saying, Stop crying now, enough is enough. We'll go home, you'll have a meal, you go to sleep, and you'll go back to school tomorrow." Even then, you're not modeling the right behavior for your child, right? You're dismissing their feelings, you're dismissing the emotions that they are feeling. So, in your own ways, if parents can be taught to validate what the child is feeling as opposed to dismissing, I think that is also modeling positive and pro-social behaviors, as we psychologists call it. And it was a fairly longer answer, but lots of things, and of course, parents have
No,
to be
so
sort
because
of
this
kept in
show
the
is
loop.
also aimed at sports parents, I'm going to actually come back and ask, a series of questions which will help, the sports parents to know the right thing. I mean, in this instance, I have to say that I've been on many car rides like that myself as a sport parent. But my experience has been that sometimes taking a pause is also important. The hard part is to hold on to what you are feeling, your own sense of emotions, your sense of frustration, disappointment, and you are feeling it, and it's hard to deny that. But somehow, at that point of time, because you have a young person, who's really kind of, in a way, dependent on you at this point of time in their life, you have to hold on to how you're feeling and actually kind of prioritize what they need. And quite often the response has been to say, I don't want to talk
Hmm.
about it because it's just happened.
Yeah.
It's too fresh. It's like a, yes,
It's too soon also, yeah. And like I said, young kids may not have that kind of emotional capacity to be able to process, because from a child and from an athlete point of
yes.
view, you've just lost a match, right? You've trained so many days, you've given up on it, you've probably put a lot of your life on hold for this one thing, and you've not achieved the desired outcome. So there's a lot going on between these 2 years in the pink floating matter, right? So I think, and that's the bit, right? How to start the conversation, what questions to ask, what should your tone be, what the volume, the pace, all of it is a skill for parents as well. And if they look at it as a skill, and something that they can learn, I think that
Right,
is
right, right.
fruitful in a
So we'll come
longer
back to
term.
the parents bit, but I do want to take specific situations in context of a game day that happens and kind of talk about what can athletes do. So one particular situation is when right in the beginning, the athlete has a frozen start. You're a swimmer, you've been consistently clocking top times in training, but now it's a national level meet, you're standing on the block, the buzzer goes off, but your body hesitates just for a little fraction, and that can cost you that particular race of yours. What should the athlete do in the moments leading up to the race to avoid that kind of a response?
Right. I think the shortest answer, and I'll give you a longer version of it as well. The shortest answer is a pre-performance routine, and by that I mean that just as an athlete warms up physically, so whether it's a swimmer in this case, I'm sure they will have some stretches, some mobility exercises that they will do as a part of their physical warm up before to the lead up to the race, and then they go on the board. It's very important to also have a mental pre-performance routine, which is a customized series of actions that an athlete and the sports psychologist works together in the session for. It could be visualizing your best performance. It could be visualizing your strengths. It could be a few self-talk cues as well. A lot when I work with swimmers in the past, when I worked with national level swimmers, we had come up together with certain words that the athlete would sort of keep repeating to themselves when they're on the board and before just the buzzer goes off and then they take the jump. So self-talk cues work very, very handy, and understanding that this pre-performance routine is for my mind also to be alert and charged so that my physical performance is in sync is something that is very, very crucial to avoid frozen starts. And one thing that I definitely recommend all athletes is to practice this pre-performance routine, right? So they should be doing that in their practice sessions, in their training sessions, in their academy pools, so that the translation of that on game day is fairly easy and automatic, and it doesn't feel alien. Suddenly, what am I doing? Right? But I just want to highlight a little point here that pre-performance routines and superstitious behaviors, there's a massive distinction between the two. And having been an athlete and now working with the population, I think the population is fairly superstitious, saying I want to wear this particular suit and I want to put my right foot first and then put my goggles and then take my cap down is not pre-performance routine. That you're doing for completely different intentions. Your pre-performance routine's intention is to get your mind ready and alert for the
Right.
upcoming
And
challenge,
let's say
which is your
something like this
performance.
has happened. Now, in that moment, your race has started. What can you do to do kind of a like a mental reset in real time?
Right. I think in the sense of with regards to swimming, um, nothing related to breath work, because a swimmer's breath pattern is in sync with the kind of hand movements and their body. So it's all in sync. So nothing related to breathing, definitely. But like I said, the self talk cues, right? If you have rehearsed your self talk well enough before jumping into the pool and during your training, reminding yourself of those little self talk cues can alert your brain to get your attention back to the task at hand, right? Because these self talk cues are primers in a way for your brain to just focus on the next lap, or to just focus on the next hand movement, or to focus on flapping your legs. And it can be very sport relevant. Ideally, it has to be something which is more instructional in nature as well, and
Can you
that
give
can act as
any
a quick mental
examples
reset.
of, let's say, self talk? And the other thing that I'm keen to know is that sometimes when an external person is saying it doesn't belong to you, so you have to, in a way, find a way for the athlete to believe it is their idea or it is their thought. How does that transfer happens from, let's say, a sports psychologist or a parent or a coach to the athlete themselves? If you could share some examples, please.
Right. Right. So it's not with a swimmer, but I've worked with a badminton athlete who would also sort of start feeling a lot of anxiety when they would lose a lot of points back to back, right? And their primary complaint was, I lose focus, I can't think of strategy, and because I can't think of strategy, I just keep hitting the shuttle anyway, right? And of course, because it's not a strategic change, you start losing more points, and that builds up the frustration and the works, right? So one of the things that we decided, most commonly used techniques to disrupt this constant negative rumination of thoughts is distraction, right? So keeping in mind that distraction and self-talk is an SOS technique that athletes can use when they're in the heat of the performance. We started using these little sticky notes, and we would stick it on their water bottle, the sipper that they have, and also staple it to one of their towels. So typically, when an athlete loses a few points back to back, they try and go to either sip on water, or wipe their face, the sweat off, and that reminder would act as a almost like a primer, saying focus on the next point, one point at a time, bend, move faster, be quicker. So, smaller words, fairly instructive in nature, and something that is relevant in the situation is something that I work very consciously and very closely with an athlete. And it's an iterative process, right? The more they practice, the more natural and organic they start feeling about it. And that's why I emphasize that even though it's an SOS, your system still needs to be well aware of why we're doing and what we're doing. So the more you train for it, just as you train your muscles in a gym, you also have to train your mind regularly when you're training, when you're in a practice zone. So I think that could be an example that I
Right,
typically
right.
tend to go to.
The other situation, which I think happens fairly often, is when an athlete makes an early mistake, and then from that point onwards, their performance kind of spiral down. a young golfer who hits a double bogey on their first hole, or even in the case of a tennis player who double faults on their first service game, and after this mistake something changes. They start playing tentatively. They make a lot of errors. Their confidence goes out of the window. Now, what can athletes again do in such a situation to prevent a full mental breakdown, that it's just one point, but what ends up happening is it ends up like snowballing and cascading? How can they prevent that?
Yeah, and I think it's one of the most common things again, to prevent a full mental breakdown and to prevent like the whole, like you said, the cascading and the snowballing. The most important technique is to focus back internally, is to shift your focus to your internal systems. Now, there are multiple ways that one can do this. The first thing that comes up to me is mindfulness, which I, in general, teach a lot of athletes, because an athlete has to be present in the moment, because they're expected to make faster decisions at a and quicker and correct decisions, right? Shifting that focus internally is something, by using mindfulness techniques, is something that I definitely recommend. And one of the most easiest way to do that is to focus on our breath. Typically, when a cascading performance sort of goes all downhill, our thoughts become very external. What if this happens again? What are people thinking about me? What's my mom, who's probably seeing me on TV, thinking about this? Our attention completely shifts outwardly. When you're focusing on your breath, or when you're consciously trying to focus on our internal systems, you're trying to actively put the spotlight on yourself. And being in connection with our breath, as cliche as it sounds, is one of the most easiest techniques to get our attention back. And that's why I rehearse these breathing techniques with athletes in sessions. And there are multiple ways, multiple breathing techniques, that one athlete can learn. Of course, the psychologist needs to be mindful of the nature of sport. So I can't give a breathing technique to a swimmer, because, like I said, their breaths are in sync. But say a badminton athlete or a golfer, right? There can be sport specific stuff as well, which is in sync with the kind of cardiovascular capacity the athlete needs for the sport. In a high paced sport like badminton, I will have to work with the rhythm that the athlete has. In a sport like golf, I know the athlete would have time. So I would sort of give them a much more detailed, say like a 4-7-8, where they inhale for 4 counts, they hold the breath for 7 counts, and they have a longer exhalation for 8 counts. Something that can then center their attention back
Okay.
internally
So you're
is
saying
something that is it.
breathing is something that can help in a situation where uh, you've just made a mistake and things are going out of hand. Okay. The other situation is where there is the presence of an overwhelming crowd. You've played probably in small tournaments, but now you're in the finals of a major event, and it's packed stadium, and you're not used to attention like that. Now, what mental techniques can they use to kind of tune out of those external distractions and focus in on their game?
Right. I think this is a combination of a lot of in session work and then the kind of techniques that one can extrapolate to the game situation, right? And what I mean by that is, it's imperative for a sports psychologist to prepare the athlete for this big ticket events, right? Once you know that the athlete is competing at the national level, you have to be able to build this sense of competitive mindset that you will face a bigger crowd. If it's not your day, the crowd will be cheering against you. So there would be a lot of that. So there has to be a lot of work being done in terms of addressing these expectations head on. The fear of disappointing coaches, say if there's somebody who's come to scout them, parents, needs to be discussed at length in sessions with the athlete. And as an SOS or an on day game event, again, teaching them techniques that can help them focus on the process as opposed to an external environments, is very very beneficial. And I use a technique called as the spotlight technique, where I explain to them that our attention is like a spotlight. It is in your control currently. Because of the overwhelming environment, the spotlight is going to who's sitting in the crowd, what are they thinking about me, what if I lose, will I get that seat in the Indian team, or will I get that particular scholarship. You need to realign the spotlight to yourself, and by that you mean, what can be my next service, where is my opponent's weakness, what my next strategy or my next combination should look like. And if you can have these strategic conversations, it's a very intelligent way to bring back the focus on process. And then it, of course, it takes a lot of time and mileage to build this process mindset versus taking them
Interesting. So
away
I think
from the
you did
results
answer
mindset.
also the bit about important people, because it may not be a very big crowd. It could just be three people who are standing, and those three people happen to be your parent, your coach, and probably a scout who's going to decide, whether you're chosen for this particular
Yeah.
spot or not. And I think the fear of disappointing people who are like very important, because I feel like in that moment you kind of stop thinking of how you're feeling, and you're probably more focused on how you're looking. So your mind is looking at yourself from the point of view of your parent to say, there you go, there you go, there's
Of
my
others.
mom, there's my dad. He's gonna say, you did that again, huh? So even before you make that particular action, it's like you've been hijacked already. Uh, I'm also asking this from the context of not every athlete may have access to a sports psychologist. What could they be doing when they're faced with such a situation? Again, I think you gave a great example of the couple of techniques that you shared, the spotlight technique. Any other in the moment thing that can help them?
I think from my experience, I completely agree. The accessibility is a massive issue in the Indian context. Here is where the coach comes into the picture, right? Traditionally, as well, we've sort of seen coaches being at the helm of an athlete's performance. Very commonly, when an athlete is a high performance athlete, the coaches become key decision makers about their performance, their training, what camps to attend, what tournament to play, when to rest, how much to train, are big decisions that the coach typically either makes or recommends to the parents, and then the parents sort of make the decision for the athlete, right? So having a very good relationship with your coach, right, a very strong relationship with your coach is one of the most commonly cited examples by athletes in my sessions, as well as in research confirms this. It's a sense of confidence for athletes, having that open channel communication with one's coach, knowing that if there is something going on in my head, I can park it with my coach, and then he can address it for me later, or they can help me process it later. And that sense of reassurance almost helps athletes sort of manage this. If you don't have a coach like that, finding an external source, that could be that you could seek that from a parent, you could seek that from a friend, a partner, a senior athlete, but having that sense of social availability that you can go and speak to someone is definitely recommended when you don't have an access
Right.
to a
So
trained
that
mental health professional.
makes sense that you could be seeking that from your own network, from someone who you trust, and who may
Yes.
be well placed to kind of advise you or help you in that particular situation.
Yes. And I think in big academies, you typically tend to have senior athletes also who mentor junior athletes, whether formally or informally, right? And building that relationship, even when a junior athlete is idolizing the senior one, there's still that camaraderie which helps them also build these
Yeah, I
coping
think that's a
skills
great point, because I think what
indirectly.
that does is sometimes with a parent or a coach, that relatability may be lower in the sense of saying, what do you know? What do you know of what it
Yeah.
feels like? But with a senior or a peer or a senior athlete, they exactly, and if so, it has more credence or it has more credibility when they say something. So I think that's a great point. Also, let's speak
100%.
about the overthinking trap that they've been practicing for months, their game routine, and this is what's going to happen. But suddenly, again, high stake game, or you kind of take it as a high stake game, and you start overthinking instead of trusting your body in that moment. So, why do athletes sometimes lose, their what they have automatized, the automatic flow, and start over analyzing their movements? And what can they do?
I think what you're trying to say, and it's a brilliant question again, what disrupts their automaticity could be everything that we've discussed until now. The fear of, say, failure, the performance pressure, the pressure of expectations. If they are somebody who's experiencing that kind of anxiety, that kind of nervousness, even that can be a disruptor to their automaticity almost. And also the stress, right? Sometimes it could be physiological as well, where they could be tired, they could be fatigued, They could be having a minor niggle or a spasm, but they're trying to push through it. And sometimes that pain then demands your attention and demands your focus. So it can be a myriad of things that can disrupt this automaticity. And also, sometimes I've also noticed in athletes that this sense of perfectionism, that I've got the point, but I didn't execute the shot the way I've trained for. I could have done better, right? Sometimes thoughts like this can also be sort of automaticity disruptors. It's almost like it disrupts their mental muscle memory, right? Because they're in the zone of concentration, but that one little thing or that one trigger sets them off, and they're completely distracted, right? And this is what then tends that they tend to sort of lose their rhythm, and that is where teaching an athlete, one cannot teach flow, but helping them understand the concept of flow, helping them understand how the brain works when you're in a state of hyper concentration, and what can you do to experience that state of flow is imperative in your sessions with the athlete. Because like when an athlete sort of feels that their brain is interfering and is simply giving them a lot of instructions, of course their focus is going to
I mean,
shift.
I feel that it's still fairly hard to do with the young athletes because I don't think their minds are so sophisticated to kind of rationalize and
Yeah.
understand it. They may get it, but in that moment, they may still not be able to execute what they kind of learned from that.
But I think that's where even techniques, like it doesn't always have to be a mental technique. But I work with young athletes and I correctly understand what you're trying to say is to untie your shoelace, take a toweling break, sip on water. To break that, physically to break that, can also be an intervention enough in that very moment, especially when an athlete is not so emotionally sophisticated or isn't able to understand that I'm losing this because there's a
Yeah,
overthinking
yeah. I
trap
mean, just to
going
share an
on in
example
my
with
in my
you,
head.
this is something that happened with my daughter. And, there was a moment where, again, things went out of hand. And I asked her later on at some point of time, what do you think you could have done differently in that moment, which may have helped you? Uh, and she said that I should have taken water. I should have drank from my bottle, which I found a very sophisticated response because, again, so much, work around hydration and why hydration is important. And I said, that's great. That can be your cue. So next time, if you're experiencing that onslaught of stress and things are not going your way, you could take a sip of water. But the next time that happened also, and I actually physically checked the whole bottle through the course of the game, there was not even one gulp that had been taken from that bottle, right? So here is a young athlete who understands that this is the ideal response, but to be actually be able to, do that. Uh,
Yeah. And I think that's where the environment needs to step up, right? So if the athlete, say for example, has come up with this own technique, very highly likely that they will stick to it as well in the long run. But till that behavior becomes organic, or till the behavior is completely integrated and it becomes their new normal, so to speak, there has to be reinforcement coming in from the environment. That is where the role of coaches step in. That is where the parent also steps in, right? To reinforcing, hey, we had spoken about this, why don't you just sip? Or there could be something that you can do for her when you're sitting in the crowd,
yeah.
and that acts as a reminder
Yeah,
for
yeah.
her to go and
I
sip
want to
on
shift
water.
gears and come back to what we were talking about sports parents. And now, in each of these situations, the athlete had frozen or made an early mistake, or, whatever was the reason why their performance had a dip. You're standing on the sidelines. And often enough, that athlete is at that moment, they turn and they look at you. They look at the face of the parent, of the coach. What is it that you should be doing? What is it that you should be saying? What should be your response?
Right. I wish there were straightforward answers to all these questions. How easy would it be for all sport parents? But again, it's very very important. Firstly, from tournament preparation point of view, and I know it may sound very elite to a certain population, but it's very important to discuss with your child whether you want me to be there on game day or not, because there can be unrealized ways in which parents might pressurize the child, right? In knowingly unknowingly having that conversation the night before the game, or organizing their training in such a way where it's all guns blazing for the week, and the child start feeling, oh, is it because now I'm going to play a tournament and now my mom wants me to win? In unrealized ways, this pressure can sort of pass down to your child, and no, it's like expecting that high performance and perfectionism on that day. So it's very important to discuss this with the child, and say your child says no, but you still want to go and attend, which is what a lot of parents, they still want to see their child in the element, right? One of the things that you definitely need to understand is, if you're going to overemphasize on just winning, forget winning. Your child is not even going to enjoy the sport, right? The primary purpose of playing sport is so that they can have fun on court, and knowing that when they're enjoying, when they're in the element, they're mindful, their performance is going to be positively impacted, is the basic thumb rule. You want your child to enjoy, especially when they're young ones, right? You, if the child is so fearful or develops a fear of competitions, highly possible that they're not wanting to willingly participate in a tournament, right? So not overemphasizing on, you have to win, she is your schoolmate, you have to be able to win with her, you cannot lose more than 6 points against her, and she's an easy player, you're a high ranked player. As valid as all of these statistics and numbers can be very mindful of conversations. The second is not exacerbating also their anxious responses. Sometimes, yes, children can, young athletes can sort of act out of the emotion or the mood that they are sort of experiencing, but not even dismissing it, like I said earlier, right? Validating that yes, what you feel is absolutely valid. I've had a parent and a child in a very similar situation, and when I was doing the debrief at the end of my session, I asked the parent saying, have you never experienced anxiety? Imagine for a moment you're working on a budget for your department, you're heading the department, and your president of the company calls you in, saying that's it, now is it when you present, and now the whole board is going to review it in front of you, and say you're not prepared, or you, even when you're prepared, it's the fear that, oh my god, I'm going to present it to the whole board. Would you not feel a surge of sudden panic or sudden stress, right? Sharing this with your child only normalizes this, because a lot of times young athletes will be like, yeah, but my mom never talks to me about these things. It helps deepen that relationship, and it normalizes both. It's also sometimes quite revelatory for parents to be like, hey, I never think about it like that, right? So that is one thing that can work in this kind of situation. And like same thing, never say don't be nervous. That's the first thing that I tell parents, right? You're dismissing, you're invalidating. Instead say, hey, what you're feeling is okay, let's focus on you having a good time on court. Or remember when this training session went so well and you were so happy when you came home. Remember what went well. So emphasizing on their strengths, again emphasizing on those good training sessions, those kinds of memories can help,
And also
can
probably
help very
knowing your
much.
own boundaries, because I feel like sometimes as parents we overtalk, and overtalking is a symptom of our own nervousness and
Hmm.
anxiety, and you're saying all the things, all the right things. You're saying
Can be,
it's going to be great, you put in so much work,
can be.
and it's going to be fantastic, I know you've got it, which is maybe at some level transfer of pressure that's happening, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think one of the things, like even like a technique that I always tell all my parents is this: that towards the end of the day, say you may not have, not everybody has the privilege to have the whole family sitting around the dinner table and having dinner. But say when you have the last, say like that conversation before the day ends, asking your child what was the highlight of your day and what didn't work in your favor. That one little thing, right? That can, in a way, also emphasize that as much as I want to know what didn't work for you, I want to know what went well today. It's a very small conversation, but as you build it over a period of time, you're encouraging the child to also move away from just focusing on results and having that process growth mindset, almost. So smaller things like that can also, it doesn't have to be a massive psychotherapeutic intervention, but little bits that can help
Yeah,
emphasize
yeah. I mean, I
the
feel
effort a
like
lot
as
more.
again as a parent that it's the everyday conversations, uh, and the awareness that we bring in our own conversation, awareness of how we are, what are we feeling. So, for example, if the child is sharing what went well or what did not, having the, I don't know, the courage or the tenacity to hold on to what that may trigger in you, and just kind of honor what they are saying in that moment.
Yeah,
I feel like becomes
yeah.
kind of important. So I think, yeah, we spoke about uh, how parents contribute to game day anxiety. We were in that moment when we were saying that the let's say something has gone not for the athlete in favor of them. You spoke about what are the things that the parent could do. They could take themselves out of the equation if they feel that they're not well equipped in that moment to handle, because the last thing you want is the child to look at, to look back and look at that scowling face, and yes, for things to go downhill. What is the worst thing that a parent can say, yeah, at that moment, or what are the things that parents should avoid saying?
Like I said, anything that is going to dismiss what the child has expressed is something that definitely needs to be avoided. It's a big, big, big no-no, because if you look at it from a macro point of view, you are thwarting almost their emotional development. You're sort of passing on to the message that crying is bad, being cranky is not correct, it's not ideal, expressing these emotions is wrong, and this may not be correct or ideal for them as they develop from like an 11-12 year old, go through the teenage and adolescence and things like that. So nothing that is going to dismiss them. Also, at the same point, of course, I don't mean to encourage that when a child is throwing rackets and abusing their equipment to allow them to do that, but finding the right space and time for that conversation, explaining that some things are not tolerated, for what reason, right? A lot of times, even in my sessions, when I work with younger athletes, and I allow them, say, and I tell them, I may do a lot of talking, but you need to stop me and ask me a question. And over a period of time, when I build a good relationship with the athletes, there are so many why. But why this? Who does this? Where can I do this? How can I do this? Right? Explaining them the reason and the intention is very, very as tedious and as time consuming. And I can completely be on the parents' understanding level as well, that it may be very fairly exhausting as well. But if you're going to just tell a child to do it, right, there is enough research and experiential evidence that the child is
Not to do.
potentially going to do something that you've told them not to do. But if you reason and rhyme with them, right, fairly likely that eventually they will adapt. And if you build that kind of culture, and that's where I would say that integrating these things in a regular life, not just keeping this sport specific, but looking at sport from a life skill development point of view, from a growth mindset point of view, is where sport also teaches a lot, right? And I say this very, very often, that I wouldn't be half the person I am if I had not played table tennis. A lot of what skills I have today are something that I draw from my time on the court, right? One of the biggest examples is I probably don't have a surge of panic when I'm going to engage in a public speaking event. It's because I've won and lost on center court. I've been in that situation multiple times to know that there is a training session available next morning, and I can still go and work on what I wasn't able to deliver on that match. So this kind of resilience, I'm not trying to say that this is ideal, but what I'm trying to say is it does teach you certain life skills which go beyond sport, right? Which is very, very important a perspective to
Yeah,
have when
yeah.
you have young children playing
So we
sport.
spoke about how parents can help athletes. How can parents help themselves? Because, okay, so you are a
Hmm.
parent, you're going through a whole gamut of emotions. So much work went into it. You sacrificed your own, in some cases, even careers. You were driving them to practice, adjusting your own schedules. And all of this seems to come to naught because, yet again, yet another disappointment, yet another low performance, and you are feeling what you're feeling. How do you cope with your own emotions? What do you do with this sense of disappointment, this frustration, and what do you make of it?
Right. I think I completely understand this as well, because having been an athlete, my parents were very, very exactly the description that you're given, right? Very focused on making me a national champion, making me, giving everything at my disposal, saying, you want to go for training? Here's facility available. You want to go for training camps? Here's what we can do. Here's how we can ease your travel and things like that. And of course, with this making available these resources, there is an unknowing surge of expectations. So that's the reason why, at least as a practice at Empower, where I've set in an SOP where we sort of say that when a parent comes in for the first session, as important as it is to ask the athlete what their goals are, it's very important to ask the parent what their goals are as well. Right? What are the goals that you think you have for your child? What do you think your goals are from a sports psychology point of view? And helping them with these expectation setting, helping them set proactive goals is something that I do right from the get go, so that we're able to build in a long term perspective as well. Because when an athlete is a 12, 13 year old is doing very well at the state level and is looking at playing for the, say, for the country, they are going to be in the sport for another at least 10, 8 to 10 years. So building that kind of mileage, the mental mileage as well, is very important for the parent. Seeking support from the partner becomes very, very important. Dividing responsibilities with your partner becomes very important. I know in some cases it may not be possible for whatsoever reasons, and reasons that sometimes may be even beyond the parent's control, but seeking support is very, very, very crucial, because it is very it does take a different skill set to be a sport parent, and the awareness currently is very low about it, right? And that's the reason why questions like what can I do for my child, what can I say, how can I better support, sort of start cropping up. So my biggest bit is people save people, and if you can rely on somebody who can support you in this journey with your own child, it's definitely advisable. And at any point, if you think that things are going beyond, always seek professional help. There are a lot of sports psychologists who work very closely with parents. It may not only be from a debrief about what your child, what the session with your athlete was, but also seeking support about what can you do to better support your child. Um,
Right.
Conversations like that can definitely help.
You said that there are different skills required to be a sport parent. What would those skills be?
I think a growth mindset for parents is also very important. Having that resilience is very, very important. And I see that when parents of athletes who may not have played sport themselves find it very difficult to adjust to this. Why is my child losing every time? Right? I'm not saying now all athletes should only play sport if their parents have played sport, but nowadays there's a whole expectation that no, my child should be good at sport, my child should be excellent at studying, and he cannot miss an exam, and they need to do well both ways. I think taming those expectations, adapting those expectations as we go on is very important. Developing communication skills is very, very important. And I don't only mean that with the child, but also with the coaches. The way that you're communicating your expectations and your emotions with the coaches is important. There's a whole model called a sport parenting expertise model, which outlines 8 key skills that parents of athletes, especially the high performance journey athletes, need to be aware of. And one of them is also about how organizationally organized are you going to be? How well are you going to be able to take care of logistics? Because an athlete would need to travel quite often. An athlete would need to skip on school, skip on social life, and all of those bits. And how does that then fit into the way that your schedule is? And learning emotional coping skills, because as we've spoken about extensively, when your child is playing on the court is very, very normal for you to also feel the whole range of emotions, right? So knowing what you can do for yourself in that moment and not letting it slide is my biggest recommendation. What can you do to control your anger better? How can you process your disappointment better, your fear better? Because it's very common for a parent to feel, oh my god, what is going to happen when my child goes on court? And I'll give you an example. My mother, for all 12 years, has never once seen me actually live play on court. She just couldn't handle the pressure. All she has seen is all the recorded games when she knows he either have won or have lost. And it was just that, because she would come to the stadium, but she would keep walking outside the stadium because she
Right.
just couldn't physically handle the stress that, and TT being a very fast-paced sport. So I think knowing what one can do for themselves emotionally is very important. A skill that sport parents specifically need to learn, because that environment in a stadium is one of the most volatile
And I'm going
environments
to
there
zero down
is
on
to be
that
a
question
part.
again, because I heard you say that you talk about creating long-term goals with the parents, understanding, and if they're going to say that it's all about winning, maybe you're going to help them see that if this has to be a long term. I get that, but I'm just saying, in that particular moment when you're there and you're feeling extremely disappointed and frustrated, what do you do with those emotions, and how do you, is there a tip or a you know
Yeah, I think the one of the tips, and it may not be a technique, but one perspective is to understand and try and take a macro perspective, saying what is it expected of me currently? Do I have the time and space to express my anger and disappointment? Or for me, it's more important to tend to my child right now. And as romantic as I make it sound on this podcast, it's a very difficult skill to own. It's very common for a
yes.
parent to be so frustrated that they have a moment of expression, and then I'm sure the expression of anger follows with a sense of guilt and a sense of I should have not done that. I should have not said that in front of so many people, right? And that's why I say that actively working on your coping skills is very important. Knowing what my anger looks like, what is my chosen way of expression, and what can I do to process it in the moment, but then also tend to it in a
Right, right.
safer
So it
environment
feels
is
like
very important.
parents sometimes need more of a sports psychologist than probably the athlete would. Hmm.
I think they definitely need an outlet. I wouldn't dismiss the bit, and it needs to go in hand with what you're doing with the athlete. And that's the reason why when you work with young athletes, parents have to be kept in the loop for. And I'll again say this: it is with keeping in mind the athlete's privacy and data confidentiality, but they have to be able to be made a part of the process for it to be integrated in the
Just one
athlete's
final
lifestyle.
question I want to ask, because this is also sometimes very widely debated. How important is exposure to high pressure situations in developing, mental resilience? Should an athlete intentionally be seeking out pressure moments, and especially for someone who's not been doing well in those situations in the past?
The shortest answer is yes. There is a lot of research behind something called as pressure training or simulation training, where we as sport psychologists work alongside coaches to come up with pressure scenarios. Either we ask the athlete to visualize the pressure situation and then step into it. So the one of the most common ways is for a TT athlete to be given a situation that it's a decider game and you're 9-5 down and the service is in your opponent's hand. What do you do then? You want to be able to win in this match. What do you do? So we come up with these pressure situations, or footballers being told that this is a penalty kick or this is a free kick, or we rehearse the penalty shootouts. It's very important to create that simulation in their training environment where there is no consequence at the end, so the athlete can practice the mental skills that they've been doing and learning in their sports psychology sessions to train their brain and their mind about how to manage that pressure better, because we cannot do away with penalty situations in a competition. We cannot tell the umpire that's it, we're not playing the penalty, it is what it is, right? You are going to have to go through that pressure, so it's only fair to train your brain and your mind
Right. So that's interesting.
for
You're saying
performance
that you
pressure.
can simulate those situations and work on it. But would you say that they should be seeking actually participating in tournaments? So if you're low confidence, your performance not being optimal, will putting yourself more out in tournaments, more competitions help or harm?
I think there wouldn't be a straight answer to this because it will definitely depend, and a whole chunk of it depends on the athlete's personality. So I would have to look into what is better going to suit my athlete. Like you correctly said, even if my athlete is currently not in their best form, non-participation makes logical sense, but will that non-participation bring in more complacency, will validate their non-participation, and will that be good in their for them in the long term is something that needs to be thought about very well, keeping the athlete, their traits, their personality, their coping mechanisms in mind. However, on a broader level, competition is always nice, is something that I believe. Exposing yourself to even friendly matches, if not a competition, playing with variety of players is very important, so that you are able to put yourself through multiple different situations and you give yourself the best shot at being prepared, right? So I sort of always recommend parents saying, even if they are not participating in a tournament, if you can put together a friendly match, right, that could also be a good opportunity for them to practice these
Right.
mental skills that we so learn
Fantastic.
in our
I think you've
sessions.
shared some very interesting insights, and I would say that you've shown also tremendous empathy for the parents themselves, because I feel like they're kicked a lot to say that you're the bad guys. You bring all the expectations. You just like spoil it all for the athlete. But I love the fact that you speak with empathy for the athlete and for the parent. Thanks so much, Dr. Sanika, for being on Raising an Athlete.
Thank you, and thank you for curating such brilliant questions, such pointed questions for the athlete population as well as parents. It was brilliant to be on the other side.
You have
I hope
absolutely
I've done
done that.
justice
Thank
to
you.
your
Thanks so
questions.
much.